I'm guessing you know the story of Robin Hood. It's pretty famous, that dastardly thief who steals from the rich to give to the poor and sticks it in the eye of the evil sheriff of Nottingham. And as far as I know, he's also the only hero whose story is told by a singing rooster. But what you might not know is that there are Robin Hood stories from around the world, and here in Japan, their version is a man named Ratboy. Rodent boy? Mouse boy? The translation's imperfect. So I'm just gonna go with Ratboy. Let's talk about Ratboy. They say never meet your heroes, but I disagree. Meet every hero, tear them down, analyze them, and in the end you may realize that you have the capacity to be a hero too. Because I'd argue that being a hero is less about your choices and more about the society that you make them in. Ratboy has been called both hero and villain, and there's no question he was a prolific thief. Over the course of his life, he stole the modern-day equivalent of around $100 million. But he spent it primarily on prostitutes and gambling, even though that's not how he's remembered. Because he stole from the upper class. He stuck it to the man. And his story, it's not all that complicated. He started out as an apprentice in his father's work, but soon his gambling debts were overwhelming and he had to start to steal for a living. He would sort of walk into a samurai's home, take what he could, and walk out again. The perfect crime, really. And what's more, the samurai were so ashamed of having been robbed. I mean, it went against their honor and the fact that they couldn't take care of themselves, so they didn't even admit that he'd robbed them. He got away with it for such a long time. But all good things come to an end, and eventually he was captured. And if they'd punished him justly, I bet that's the last we would have ever heard of it. His name would have never shown up again. But they were pissed. He stole a lot of money. So they cut off his head and paraded it through town. And that grisly decapitation, it served to lionize him. The upper class, the nobility, had shown their lack of honor. It isn't so much Ratboy's heroism that turns him into a hero, it's the upper class lack of honor, their villainy. In Ratboy's story, I see two narratives competing for legitimacy. The first is the idea of this gentleman thief, this poor burglar going around stealing to give back to his community, to help his family and friends. And the other is this idea of the samurai myth, this upper class with strict rules of honor, dignity, and justice. The Bushido code, chivalry, whatever you want to call it. And neither of these ideas hold up to any real scrutiny, but they've been competing for the minds of the people across the globe throughout history. Is civilization held in the upper class, or is true civility among the noble poor? After all, what makes Robin Hood so interesting? What makes his story so long-lasting? He wasn't real, and the person he's based on probably didn't care too much about the poor. Roger Godberd certainly wasn't a villain, but he wasn't really a hero either. He was a landowner who was certainly fighting for his farm more than he was fighting for the democracy of the poor. And as far as I can tell, he didn't know a single singing rooster. But who was he fighting? How chivalrous and noble were they? Regardless of Roger Godberd's intent, his enemies were less democratic than he was. In a time when there was already huge oppression of the poor, they fought for more inequality and less representation. The common people had no recourse. It makes sense why they would pass around stories of heroes who fought against injustice and inequality, even if they weren't true. If the people who you have to get justice from are also causing the injustices against you, where do you turn, if not a story? In the movie Braveheart, they've reimagined William Wallace as a commoner. Why? Undoubtedly the same reason they've done so with Robin Hood, because a lord fighting for power and influence doesn't resonate that well with the people they rule over. In the modern narrative, the lord is always corrupt, and the commoner is the noble one. But it's a feel-good myth and nothing more. So how will the thieves of our society be perceived in the future? Who are the people being called Robin Hood in my lifetime? Well, let's see. There's a few who stole from banks, like the hacker BX1 or Spain's Enrique Duran. They didn't really hurt anybody physically, so they're easier to view as morally driven. But then there's also the crime bosses like Pablo Escobar, Judas Coke, or even El Chapo. Violent, abusive, criminal men. But they all gave money to the poor in their communities, even if just as a way to keep loyalty. Regardless of the people and institutions they hurt, they've all been called Robin Hood by somebody. And that's just it. Who is Robin Hood if not another era's outlaw? Who's Ratboy if not a gambling-addicted thief? The longer that these narratives exist in our public consciousness, the more our great game of telephone distorts them. It turns them into the heroes that we demand they become. Will Pablo Escobar someday be considered a champion of the people? Probably not. He was a pretty horrible guy. But I'd argue it has less to do with him and more to do with the society around him that decides. The worse things are for the people on the bottom, the more likely that they'll find a story that makes them feel powerful, that makes them feel like they can find their own justice, even if it's criminal. This is Rare Earth. Boppity boppity boo boo, bee boppity boo, boo da 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 boo.